Hi everyone! Before we get into Unnatural Vegan's bizarre rationalization for having biological children, I feel like I should make a few disclaimers. Although I do consider myself an antinatalist, 1, I don't hate babies, I love babies. 2, politically, I do not support taking away people's reproductive rights. And 3, I recognize that antinatalism is counterintuitive. Creating a life is not an obvious moral evil like taking a life is. And disclaimer number 4, overpopulation is not where my focus lies regarding climate action, because it is not the core issue. The problem is not humans, the problem is overconsumption driven by capitalism. If you choose to have kids, I may not agree with your decision philosophically, but I'm not going to come for you and tell you you can't call yourself an environmentalist. But if you try to argue that environmentalists ought to have children, I'm gonna respond because that is absurd.
So virtually all of us, at least those of us watching videos like this, we care about the environment, we want to do our part. And it's very common now for companies, even mainstream companies, to claim that their product is good or better for the environment. But unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation surrounding environmentalism and just not a whole lot of evidence. Even experts, even people who study this sort of stuff for a living, can lead us astray. This infographic is a really good example. It's a visual representation of the climate mitigation gap. It's a paper by Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas. And it's a mix of actual science with uncritical claims using bad methodology. Because the falsehoods here are so extreme, the chart ends up being like 90% wrong, which sucks for those of us who really care and we want to do our part for the environment and we want to actually be effective. Unfortunately, people really don't know how to be effective. They really don't know what does and doesn't benefit the environment. So where is this huge gap coming from, this gap between belief and reality surrounding environmental impact? I think a lot of it is wishful thinking, right? But a fair amount is also just bad science being picked up and promoted by journalists who don't know how to look at stuff critically.
This is what irks me so much about Unnatural Vegan. She really believes she is the arbiter of rationality and good science. Yet she demonstrates time and time again that she's just a pseudo-intellectual pot calling the kettle black. She'll present a sloppy, incoherent argument and get mad when someone misrepresents her, and then turn around and grossly misrepresent a reasonable, well-structured argument.
And so you end up with infographics like this, promoting having less kids to fight climate change, then being regurgitated by articles like this, devoid of virtually any practical criticism. There's just one line at the end with no explanation of how this line makes the entire point of the article and the study it's referencing irrelevant. The climate crisis is right now. We'll either have figured shit out in 100 years, meaning people will be living sustainably, or we'll be screwed way before that.
Choosing not to have children certainly won't solve the climate crisis, but that doesn't mean that your child's emissions won't contribute to the problem. And as for whether we will get our shit together in time or be screwed, things are looking pretty bleak. This only strengthens the argument for antinatalism. I don't want to burden another individual with the stress of a collapsing society. A child's resource consumption is one factor in my moral assessment of procreation, but their suffering, especially from eco-anxiety, is another factor.
The lifetime emissions of our grandchildren just don't matter, and that's accepting the flawed methodology of the study. So let's look at the study this all stems from. All they did was assume current average emissions and assigned 50% of each of your children's lifetime emissions to you, and then 25% of grandchildren, 12.5% of great-grandchildren, and so on, divided by your lifetime. The first problem is that they tried to account for genetic contribution, but didn't even attempt to account for environmental contribution. They only say it'll change if national emissions drop, but that is not nearly enough. If we do what we can to reduce our footprint, let's say by 75%, so like eating plant-based, limiting driving, doing what we can to be energy efficient at home, do we really think that our children have a 0% chance of following in our footsteps? So they have a 100% chance of just living like a typical consumer? It's a really serious confounding variable, and one that could definitely outpace genetic contribution. For example, if you have one environmentally conscious parent instilling those values, even if it means the child reduces his or her footprint by only 51% relative to the norm, you end up with negative emissions because the 51% reduction is larger than the 50% contribution of DNA. Let's say that the kid ends up having the same 75% reduction as the parent. Well, then that assumption flips it from being 50 tons CO2 equivalent a year from having one more child to being negative 25 tons CO2 equivalent per child. The parent's contribution is then a net sequestration. So the argument would then be have as many children as possible as long as you reduce your own footprint by more than 50%. Even if we reduced by a mere 51%, having children would still be net green, assuming that they follow in our footsteps.
I listened carefully to her argument here like 12 times, and I'm still confused. If you look at the study, they state the carbon savings as a range and acknowledge the limitations of the data. The child of an environmentalist will likely have a significantly lower impact than the child of an average consumer. But regardless of how eco-conscious you are, you still consume resources. Your child's footprint may be significantly lower than average, but that doesn't make it negative. The only way you could argue that having a child would result in net negative emissions is if your kid became a freaking climate activist with a massive platform. But that's quite a high bar to set for a kid. More likely than not, your kid will produce more emissions than they offset. So where is the sequestration?
Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns here. Obviously, everything I said was based on assumptions. But once we reach adulthood, we tend to hold similar values as our parents. A kid growing up in an environmentally conscious home is more likely to grow up to be environmentally conscious themselves.
More likely, yes, but there are no guarantees. And again, eco-conscious people still have an environmental footprint.
And just a little aside, it's not clear-cut like here's the genetic contribution and here's the environmental contribution. Clearly, genetics plays a role in the environmental contribution as well. It's not actually clear how much parental involvement actually plays a role. By that I mean, are we environmentally conscious because our parents actively taught us those values? Or are we environmentally conscious because our parents were genetically predisposed to be environmentally conscious, and so we are genetically predisposed to be environmentally conscious? Obviously, some combination of the two, but twin studies suggest that genetics play a larger role than we would like. Regardless, ignoring the potential massive difference between the influence of an environmental parent and like a typical parent is a huge oversight.
Most people care about the environment. The problem is that the system we live in is inherently unsustainable and reinforces behaviors that harm the environment, and we're taught not to question this system. There's a lack of education, not a lack of green genes.
The second and even larger problem with the study is that they ignore non-replacement rate reproduction. Each fewer person means there is a void that needs to be filled through incentivizing people to reproduce more or immigration. There's nothing wrong with immigration, but moving from a poor country to a wealthier one can mean from around 10 times the emissions to up to 100 or more when comparing the richest to the poorest. So obviously this is yet another huge confounding variable.
What? This woman is a proud neoliberal who thinks economic growth is a good thing. Yet here she acknowledges that wealth correlates with emissions. She lives in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, and she thinks that her kids have net negative emissions because she's instilling eco-conscious values.
Declining populations are a huge problem for economies and supporting the older generation with entitlement programs. Japan and China are suffering some from these issues now, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better. A very gradual decline in population can be sustainable for a while, but we're already on a dangerous trajectory here in the developed world.
This is only true for a growth-based economy, which is inherently unsustainable. Capitalism's growth imperative is what leads to these problems. The solution here is economic degrowth, not incentivizing procreation.
There's no reason to think it's going to be perfectly one-to-one, but it's entirely plausible that for every kid an environmentalist passes on, decides not to have, there's a 50, 75, or even a 99% chance of that space being filled by another, and it's very unlikely to be filled by another environmentalist.
Where is she getting these numbers? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Swayze.
So without knowing how all of these confounding forces play out, you can't claim that skipping a kid results in these kinds of reductions. If we were on a growth track, that might be a credible claim, but not when our reproduction rates are already declining. If there's a 99% chance of that spot being filled anyway if you don't have a kid, it's not 50 tons, it's half a ton. If there's a 99% chance of that spot being filled by an average consumer, then we're leaving it up to conservatives to fill out the population. You could be looking at a harm of 50 tons per year from not having a child. And that doesn't even consider the systemic harms from conservatives gaining in voting power and overturning environmental initiatives.
She's presenting a false dichotomy, as if the only way for progressives to combat conservative ideology is to have kids and raise them right. How about don't have kids and dedicate your time to political activism or education? Parents are certainly not the only influence on their children. Or adopt?
Beyond the unscientific nature of this sort of claim, it just looks bad. The optics are bad. This is as factually correct as saying that if you kill yourself right now, you will achieve the biggest possible CO2 saving. Needless to say, including this lever in the infographic is a very dumb idea because it creates a backlash and destroys good intentions. Aside from it not actually being factually anything, yeah, it's terrible advocacy. It's giving conservatives ammunition against environmentalism because it suggests that our true motives are destroying human civilization, which I don't think is true for most environmentalists. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh my god, this is such a straw man. The aim of environmentalism is to preserve the planet for future generations. We care about the planet because we care about sentient life on it. I know it's counterintuitive, but the same is true for antinatalism. We choose not to procreate because we care about suffering and want to minimize it. Antinatalism is about reducing suffering. Generally speaking, killing yourself causes more suffering than it alleviates. I feel like you don't have to be an antinatalist to recognize that the messaging, "consider having one less child," is not the same as "might as well kill yourself." This infographic isn't even suggesting that people forego having biological children completely. It's suggesting that people consider having fewer children to minimize their environmental impact. Antinatalism is the position that it's morally wrong to create life because you're bringing an individual into this world who will suffer. Consider having one less child is not an antinatalist message, similar to how promoting meatless Mondays is not a vegan message. I recognize that asking people to forego having biological children is a much higher ask than asking people to go vegan. And morally, I think there's a categorical difference between creating a life and taking a life. So while I do not support reducitarian messaging regarding the consumption of animal products, I do support this messaging regarding procreation. While I understand that the optics of certain antinatalist posts and memes are not great, if you find this infographic offensive, damn, your defenses are up. It seems like the authors of this study did consider the optics and went with softer messaging. Have one less child is much more palatable than don't have children. Regarding optics, I agree that it's important to consider them, but we should also consider the consequences of watering down the message to the point where it's lost entirely. It's a balancing act. There is value in telling the truth, even if it's unpopular and creates backlash.
Anyway, that was their most high-impact personal choice we can make to mitigate our contribution to climate change. Unfortunately, the second option isn't much better.
That's the end of her section on having children. She spends the rest of the video discussing other mitigation efforts. I won't be discussing transportation in detail here, but I wanted to share this clip to make a final point.
Biking everywhere, because everyone knows that bikes are fueled by magic. The benefit of bike riding depends entirely on the fuel. You are the engine and the food you eat is the gas. The average person can burn 50 to 75 calories per mile, and the average round-trip commute is 30 miles a day. So that's 1,500 to 2,225 calories every workday. Now, food production accounts for a quarter of emissions globally, 3 tons CO2 equivalent per person. If a bike saves you 2.5 tons, as the infographic implies, but then you produce an extra 3 tons, yeah, the math doesn't really work out in favor of biking. You'd probably be better off sticking with your car if you're not vegan or mostly vegan. If you are vegan, then biking can save you a little because doubling your food is not going to have the same impact, right? It is actually greener than running a car on gas, but an electric vehicle is still going to be the way to go due to the inherent emissions, even from plant foods. Food as produced, packaged, and distributed is just not an efficient fuel source, which is why there's no such thing as an athletic environmentalist. That's a joke.
She considers the additional food a person consumes to fuel their bike rides in her analysis, but doesn't factor in the food her children will consume throughout their entire lifetimes. What? Like, what? Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. And as always, stay tuned for next week. All right, peace out. Come here. Turn around. Hey, come here. Can you sit? Can you sit? Okay, boy, sit. Finley, sit. Sit. Hey, sit. Finley, sit your booty down. Sit, sit, sit. Sit, sit, sit. Finley, sit. Finley, sit. Hey, hey, hey. You want this? Sit, sit, sit. Good boy. Oh my God. Okay, move out of the way, boy. You're in the way.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat.